Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael, Managing Editor for Politics at Bloomberg Opinion. Today, we're going to be talking about what's unfolding in LA right now and the federal response to it. I'm here with our two LA-based columnists, Ronald Brownstein and Erica D. Smith. They both live out there. They can give us the view from what's happening on the ground. And we'll get into it and what this actually could mean for the whole country. So, Erica, let's start with you. How did things in LA, this unrest, begin, and kind of where do things stand as of this morning?
So a lot of this really began last Friday. ICE did a number of raids in the city that caught a lot of people off guard. Most of them were around the downtown area. There was one in particular, though, in what's called as the Fashion District, the Garment District, where a lot of immigrants and undocumented immigrants are actually employed. And basically, agents went into a store, tried to arrest some folks. Kind of the bat signal went out among activist groups on Instagram and online. A number of protesters showed up. A number of union members also showed up and basically kind of surrounded the business in the block and basically started using megaphones, which has been a tactic that's been used by a number of activists and protesters here, really in Southern California, but particularly in Los Angeles, advising people inside of their rights, telling people not to sign anything. That kind of escalated into a standoff. In the process, a major union leader was knocked over, was injured, but was arrested by ICE, which further inflamed things and really got California Democrats involved. From there, Saturday, we saw more raids or attempted raids, and this one in Los Angeles County, which people might have seen some of the fires that came out of that as one vehicle that was set on fire. And in the process after that, I guess that drew the attention of the president, who was aware of the unrest, decided to send in the National Guard, which again further inflamed tensions here in Los Angeles. They arrived, on Sunday. There were more protests that were more violent than the previous 2 days. And then yesterday we saw a little bit more muted protests, but also word that Trump is going to send in 2,000 more National Guards, and as well as the Marines. And I should note that during George Floyd, where protests were far more widespread, there was only 1,000 National Guards that were sent to Los Angeles. So That brings us to Tuesday morning, where we're kind of at an uneasy silence right now. Marines have arrived. Some of the National Guard members, troops here, have arrived as well. So we'll see what the day brings.
Okay, thank you, Erica. And Ron, you had a column out this morning where you talked about kind of how you see that decision to send in troops. How do you see it?
Well, it's an interesting backdrop, right? I mean, what was the story right before all of this, as Erica was talking about, broke out on Friday? Many media organizations were reporting that Trump was planning a broad-scale cancellation of federal aid to California, including terminating potentially virtually all research grants for the University of California. And I think that's an important backdrop here because, I think what we've seen through this entire episode is that it really distills Trump's view of blue states and cities, which is not as legitimate partners in governing, but fundamentally as hostile territory to be subdued. No one disputes that maintaining public safety and public order is the prime responsibility for any level of government. But, it's hard to understate how dysfunctional and unusual it is for the city, state, and federal government to be battling about how to do this rather than coordinating about how to do this. Trump went right away to federalizing the National Guard. This is something that he has wanted to do in blue jurisdictions for a long time. He has said, this is not a man who, regrets I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. He's not a man who admits to public regrets very often, but he has said that one of his qualms about his first term is that he allowed objections from Democratic governors and mayors to prevent him from sending in the National Guard faster into cities during the George Floyd protests. When he ran in 24, he proposed multiple reasons for sending the National Guard into blue states and cities, even to the point of patrolling to control crime. So, he did this right out of the gate. And that was further escalated with sending in Marines. At every juncture, Trump has chosen the option that is the most likely to provoke backlash and chaos, and then use that backlash and chaos to justify further escalation. So, on the one hand, yes, a legitimate concern for the public, for any level of government to keep public order and public safety. But I think you have to see this as part of a larger campaign by the administration to essentially subjugate blue states and cities that are resisting him and his agenda.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is something, Erica, you've also written about. You've been following Gavin Newsom's attempt to navigate Trump 2.0, for example, very closely. How does what Ron is saying fit in with your observations of Newsom and this kind of tightrope that he's walked to where he finds himself now in a more confrontational pose with the president?
Yeah, I mean, Gavin Newsom is definitely more confrontational the last 3 or 4 days. I mean, he is very upset, to use a nice word for it. But, it's interesting to what Ron was just saying. One of the things I noticed yesterday, so in the discussion about sending in the Marines or the 700 Marines, it was very fascinating because throughout the day, media organizations, including our colleagues at Bloomberg News, had information about this. The governor's office throughout the day did not know, seemingly, that the Marines are they had not confirmed. I think around 2:00 Pacific time, they put out a note saying, that we've heard that they're just being moved from one base to another, which is not the same as mobilization. The chief of LA's police department did not know at 5:00 yesterday. I don't think he had actual confirmation while giving a press conference, 5:00 Pacific time, I should say. And so it was interesting, the fact that, everybody, news organizations, lots of people seem to know that the Marines were being sent to LA or were literally on their way. But Democratic leaders in the city, in the state, had no idea or did not have confirmation, which speaks a lot to what Ron was just saying about the lack of coordination and just the deliberate division that's happening because of the Trump administration. And I think because of that, I think you see Newsom being a lot more pointed in his responses. He's not trying to do what he was doing after the fires in Los Angeles in January and trying to kind of split the middle and not trying to cater. I think in one interview yesterday, he said something to the effect of, you can't work with Donald Trump. You can only work for him, and I'm never going to work for him, which is quite a bit of a tone shift from February, where he was trying to get Republicans in Congress to approve disaster funding for Los Angeles. So we're in a very different spot here in California. And it's been interesting, at least from my reporting, to see so many elected leaders kind of really pull together. And they've been anticipating this moment. And I think there's going to be a lot more coordination coming. What they can actually do, on the other hand, is an open question. But I do think there is a sense of, Trump is the enemy and he's coming for us.
And, look, you have to see this as part of a continuum of things that have happened. Just look at some of the things that have happened since the start of the second Trump term. They have already arrested a judge in Wisconsin, a mayor in New Jersey, a U.S. representative in New Jersey, now the leader, the president of the statewide SEIU in California, all on the charge of impeding immigration enforcement. Trump has moved really in unprecedented ways to threaten blue states and cities with the cutoff of federal funds, including Title I, the principal funding mechanism. The federal government supports low-income schools if they don't adopt red state policies on diversity, on the classroom teaching of race and gender, on LGBTQ issues, and obviously support enforcement on immigration. He is moving to cancel the authority California has held since 1970 under the Clean Air Act to set its own air pollution and fuel economy standards, and that other states, blue states all, can follow. He is canceling research grants to universities that tend to be located in blue cities. And so, you kind of look across the board, and what you see is a very systematic effort, I believe, to use national power to advance factional aims, to basically impose the red state agenda, the red state vision of a conservative vision of like how the society should be ordered onto blue jurisdictions that have rejected it. I mean, the phrase I've used since his first term, which I think is even more apt in these first months of the second term, is that Trump governs as a wartime president with blue America rather than any foreign adversary as the enemy. And I think, whatever the justification for, each step in California, that looms over all of this. I mean, Trump, I don't think anybody can look at this and say that Trump is trying to find ways either to de-escalate the situation or to work with the local governments in California. He is looking to both provoke a confrontation, I think, and to kind of demonstrate, to assert dominance more than to kind of restore order. By the way, interesting polling out today on what's happening here that really goes to that, right? I mean, Erica, your column was, about Americans don't like disorder. They don't like chaos. And not surprisingly, more people disapprove than approve of the protests, and polling out today by YouGov. What makes this a little different is that there are a lot of Americans who view Trump and his approach to government also as an agent of chaos. And there is also, in the YouGov polling out today, almost exactly the same share of people, roughly 46, 47, a plurality, disapprove of the protests and disapprove of sending the National Guard and disapprove of sending the Marines. And so it's a complicated equation, in which Trump himself, I think, is viewed as fuel on the fire. That was certainly the case in 2020 as well.
Yeah. And Erica, you talked in your column also about this theme of sort of dueling realities that Ron's getting to here. And I'm wondering kind of how you see the kind of battle for the control of the narrative here.
It's interesting because, I mean, that was basically going on over the weekend. And one of the things that, if people are watching actual news coverage like TV, CNN, like TV coverage of this, you'll see a lot of activists and protesters and people out there, obviously, with cell phones. Everybody's live streaming everything to Instagram, to TikTok. And so this is creating content. And so if you're just, if you're not a news consumer through mainstream media and you get all your news through social media, and we've seen the data on that coming out of the last election, what you're seeing is Waymo's on fire. You're seeing people taking over the 101 freeway. You're seeing, trees set on fire. You're seeing, people getting tear gassed and, screaming swear words at the police. So, I mean, your perception of what is happening in Los Angeles is very different than if you're, watching local news or if you're, reading a news site. And what also gets lost is the fact that Los Angeles is gigantic. I mean, this is happening in a very small area of Los Angeles that happens to be downtown. It is not, the same day that the biggest news coverage happened, I think, which was on Sunday. There was a pride parade that was happening in Hollywood that went on with no problems. Yeah. There was the opening night for Hollywood Bowl with Hugh Jackman, who I think was the lead. I mean, it was fine. I where I live, I don't see, what you're seeing on what people are seeing on TV or seeing on social media. So there is this idea of what is the narrative? What is Los Angeles? Is it a place that is out of control and violent, and we need to send in the Marines to quell everything like it's 1992, post Rodney King? Or is this happening in a very small area of downtown, which is the reality of the situation? And so I think when you have, YouGov polling, that makes sense, that tracks. But it also goes to the fact now we have misinformation. Like yesterday, there was some of this over the weekend, but it's starting to pick up, where you have videos that are being shared from 2020, George Floyd stuff. You've got deep fakes. You've got, now you're in the information war, which is really about shaping the public narrative about what is actually happening in Los Angeles and increasingly in other cities where you're having these solidarity protests. And so that's what's really going to be interesting, I think, going forward, kind of seeing how, given there's the reality of the political situation, but then there's also the kind of the storytelling around that, which are two things that feed into each other increasingly, I think, in the US.
Right. And you don't see a lot of people sharing boring photos of just National Guardsmen standing around with nothing to do, right?
Exactly.
There you go. It's like they're there, but are they really doing anything?
Well, by the way, that's a really interesting point, right? Because Trump did not invoke the Insurrection Act. He is using an obscure authority from the 1903 law that created the modern act, that transformed the historical militias into the National Guard. Basically in his memo, he is talking about using them to protect federal personnel and property. So what they are basically doing is kind of right now, right, is standing around federal buildings to actually historically, as was explained to me over the weekend by one of the experts, historically, the authority Trump is using has always been used in tandem with the Insurrection Act. And for reasons, obvious political reasons, he seemed, unlike Stephen Miller, who's kind of chomping at the bit, Trump doesn't want to invoke the Insurrection Act because that would be much more inflammatory, and I think goes to this unusual circumstance he finds himself in, where he is, people don't like the chaos and the disorder in LA, but they don't necessarily view him as a solution to chaos and disorder. They view him in some ways as a magnifier. So he's stopping short of that step. Is he going to assert that under the legal authority he's using, that the Marines and the National Guard can interact with protesters as opposed to guard it, on the streets of LA, as opposed to if they come running up against the federal building? That would be something new, and that might be a stretch even for these courts. On the other hand, it's important to understand how expansive this memo he signed is, because it doesn't mention LA. Doesn't mention California. It is not only anywhere where there are protests against immigration enforcement. He is saying he has the right to send the National Guard or federal troops. He's saying anywhere that they might be anticipated. Mm-hmm. So this is, a woman at the Brennan Center at NYU, one of their experts, said to me, no president has ever asserted the authority to deploy the military nationwide in anticipation of protests. In the way that Trump did on Saturday. So whatever we're watching in LA, depending on how this plays out politically and on the ground, it may be a coming attraction of what they have in mind for other major cities in the country.
Mm. And I just thought I would add to that, because we had another column out yesterday from Harvard law professor Noah Feldman that kind of dug into some of those legal details a little bit. But it makes really clear why it's a big deal to sign the memo that Trump signed, to even have people talking about the Insurrection Act. Basically, I'll just give you a little snippet of it. The law on which Trump relied permits domestic deployment only in cases of invasion by a foreign nation, rebellion, or danger of a rebellion. That's not a political protest. Yeah. In a democracy, people have a right to free speech and to peaceable assembly, and we don't use the military to enforce the law against citizens unless civilian law enforcement somehow can't or won't do the job, which is what you saw, for example, during the civil rights era, the last time the National Guard was called out by a president against basically a state. So the president, using the military to suppress protests that he politically disagrees with, that is not something that we see or want to see in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a real fear that this will spread to other states, that having sort of crossed this line or tiptoed up to this line, that we could see it spread. And it's unusual to see, for example, the president showing more restraint than one of his top aides. I'm thinking of Stephen Miller. So we're also kind of in the upside down a little bit there.
Sarah,
go ahead.
Real quick, do you remember, I'm sure you do remember, part of the testimony from the January 6th committee was, they were talking about in the White House, I believe early January 2021, having Pence reject the electors and basically throw out the election. And someone, maybe one of the White House counsels, said, well, isn't this going to, trigger enormous protests, kind of Prague's velvet, the velvet revolution in the cities? And Jeffrey Clark, the assistant attorney general at the time, the one that Trump wanted to make attorney general, famously said in that meeting, that's what the Insurrection Act is for, right? I mean, that's what he said at the time. And there have always been people around Trump who have viewed that as their ultimate, trump card. And the question begin, when Tom Homan is talking about, we're going to be there every day and you can't make us back down and we are going to be out there enforcing the law. I mean, the issue is, a lot of people, and I think Erica would agree with this, a lot of people on the left of center have felt that Trump has always wanted to provoke a confrontation over some aspect of his policies that would provide the pretext for invoking the Insurrection Act, which is not exactly martial law. It's not that, and people kind of overstate what it is, but it does allow the military to directly interact with Americans. And as Newsom put it yesterday in one interview, I mean, it basically allows them to turn the military against our own citizens.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the question now is what happens next? And I'm curious to know, and Erica, I'll start with you. Mm-hmm. What is next, especially for California officials? How do they respond to this? Is there a way to de-escalate? Because I think probably a lot of California liberals would like to escalate. That's what happens when we get into an argument. That's a human instinct, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think all of our elected officials, as Ron was saying, owe it to those of us who live in this country to bring the temperature down.
Yeah.
So how do they walk this tightrope, and what are their options at this point?
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation, I think, that Newsom and LA Mayor Karen Bass and others find themselves in. Because on the one hand, the politics of California are overwhelmingly liberal. People, yes, they want to de-escalate, but yes, they want to stick it to Trump. And that's California's motto. And so, I think that most the Democrats, a number of whom were here in their district, members of Congress who were actually here over the weekend, they've gotten lots of kudos from their constituents for standing up to ICE and, making speeches and going to the detention center where some people have been held. I think that politically, they're getting lots of, attaboys proverbially. But on the other hand, there's a bigger picture, right? LA doesn't want to play into Trump's hand. They don't want to be the reason that Trump decides to invoke the Insurrection Act. And so there is kind of this middle ground where elected officials are going to be, I think, increasingly telling people, yes, protest, yes, stand up for your rights, and yes, talk, and yes, be a show of force, but don't be violent. And that's where there were things that are going to get a little tricky. I mean, yesterday, even before one of the flare-ups, I think was probably one of the first flare-ups of the day downtown, the crowd had been mostly peaceful because there was a court case for the union leader who was arrested on Friday, was released on bail, I think, and $50,000, I think, bail. And he, once he got out, people still stuck downtown. They walked over to the federal building, which is where most of the National Guard has been stationed and has become a flashpoint. And so people were there for several hours, kind of standing outside and chanting. And at one point, somebody threw a water bottle over towards the police, which this is reporting from the LA Times. People turned around and was like, don't do that. We had to do peaceful protests because these are, people who were there. But it was too late. LAPD moved in, it kind of went from there. And so there is going to be this delicate balance of managing anger. I will say, as a resident of Los Angeles, one thing I'm particularly concerned about how that's going to work is, ICE and the Trump administration says they're going to be doing raids for the next 30 days. 30 days is a very long time in a city where you have, more than 30% of folks are immigrants and people live in mixed status households. People are scared to leave their homes. I heard a story a couple weeks ago or a couple days ago about a guy who was selling fruit outside of his fruit cart that ICE just happened to pick up as they were driving by. So this kind of like culture of fear that's happening right now in Los Angeles, if that's going to exist for the next 30 days, I don't know how that's going to work. And obviously that's by design. I mean, the Trump administration wants this violence. They want this conflict. And so I think for California Democrats, it's going to be a really interesting, tricky balance to try to manage that. And I frankly don't know how that's going to shake out, but I hope it works for the best.
Sarah, if you take one step back, this really kind of goes to a broader political debate within the Democratic Party and a broader divide in the Democratic Party. I mean, there is a serious kind of divergence of opinion within the Democratic Party about how hard to fight on all of the ways Trump is trying to expand presidential power and basically, run through the rule of law versus to focus on the economy, right? I mean, there is among the leadership of Democrats in Congress, in their heart of hearts, there is no doubt that Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer wish all of this would disappear tomorrow, and they could spend the next month, as they planned, attacking the reconciliation bill as a massive transfer of wealth from the working and middle class to the rich. Basically what they want to run on above all in 2026 is that Trump promised to solve your problems with your cost of living, and all he's doing is making his rich buddies richer. And here is example number one, a massive bill that is cutting Medicaid and food assistance for the middle class and working class and providing a tax cut to the rich. That's what they want to talk about. That is without doubt, they would be happier if they were spending this week, I mean, I'm sure that there was plans to be doing all sorts of events as the Senate is considering this bill around that theme. Whereas there, in the activist kind of base of the Democratic Party, there is understandable alarm about many of the things Trump is doing that, kind of threaten the basic rule of law, basic civil rights, civil liberties, trying to roll back rights in blue states, expanding the use of barring law firms, cutting off universities, all of these things. So, people say, well, that there's a lot of Democrats are gun shy about engaging on immigration. In fact, public opinion is already distinguishing between Trump's actions on the border, which most Americans approve of, and the way he is handling deportation, which is increasingly fraught for him. And again, in this YouTube polling today, more people disapprove than approved of. But at the macro level, this is a fundamental, and I go one step further. Talk to people like David Nyan or Susan Stokes who study this around the world. It's not unique to Democrats. All over the world, parties that are running against quasi-authoritarian or strongman leaders divide between, do you run against their authoritarian actions or do you run on the price of eggs? And that is the divide Democrats are having. There are certainly Democratic. If we had various strategists for Newsom up here, they would be saying that Trump is provoking this because he wants to get attention away from his failure to bring down the cost of living or the implications of the bill. But that is a big divide for Democrats. And I do think that in Washington, the congressional leadership is invested in the idea of running on Trump as failing to solve, your cost of living. And they would probably view this as something they want to get off the front page as soon as possible. You can't really do that. You can't ignore a fire in one room in the House because you want to focus on what's going on somewhere else.
Especially because it's spreading to other cities as well. So, yeah.
Well, and I think it's true that Trump's, the polling shows that Trump's support on immigration has been falling, but it also remains one of his best issues. I mean, people are I think he's underwater enough now on enough issues that, it's a little bit of a nuanced thing. It's like people don't approve of this. At the same time, it's like better for him than the economy or, the rule of law or foreign relations or tariffs or a lot of other things that people have sort of lost favor with. But so it's often his go-to issue when he wants to change the topic.
And that's, I guess, one of the interesting things about California is it always trends a little bit, well, not a little bit, but a lot of times further to the left. And so now you have the politics of California and Californians kind of driving more of the conversation. So that's going to look a lot different on immigration than, say, Texas or even some other blue state. And so I'm sure that that's also not what Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer want either. So,
by the way, when polling looks at immigration, he's still net positive. When polling differentiates between the border and deportation, big difference, way positive on the border. Deportation is now often negative. And even on deportation, overwhelming support for mass deportation of people who've committed crimes. 60% still oppose deporting longtime residents who have not committed a crime. Roughly 60% oppose deporting people who have U.S. citizen kids. I mean, the public makes distinctions that are not always reflected. And generally speaking, yes, when the conversation is about immigration, Trump is in a stronger position than when we're talking about other things. But again, I go back to that 2020 dynamic. Americans dislike disorder. They don't necessarily like this protest. They don't necessarily view Trump as an antidote to disorder, however, and that complicates it for him. Like if the Marines get involved in a full-scale clash with protesters in downtown LA, Eric, I'm interested in your thought. I'm not sure that works to Trump's benefit.
No, it does not. I don't think so either.
Well, I think we see in a divided country where you are united in our disapproval. And I think we'll have to leave it there for today because we're just about out of time. Thank you to everyone who watched, and thanks Erica and Ron for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.